Hey everybody, welcome back to AP Gov and Politics with Mrs. Hometh. Today we're going to be tackling our final chapter of Unit 1, and the topic is federalism, which was introduced in the last chapter as one of the core principles of the US Constitution. So we'll be looking at some of the pros and cons, challenges and opportunities that this sort of structure presents within our government. So a quick look at your learning targets. We're going to look at the historical origins of federalism. Why did our founders decide on this? And then how has it evolved over time? We'll look at the pros and cons, like I said, and ultimately one of the biggest sort of push and pulls within this federal system deals with the issue of money. And so we'll be looking at how funding for federal and state governments sort of interact with each other and how that relationship has changed over time. Also, we're going to talk about sort of trends within federalism. So, who has more power and at which time? Initially, we see some major growth of the federal government, and then eventually, sort of a return of states' rights. And so, we'll look more at that relationship in the slides ahead. All right, so here we have our sort of guiding questions for this chapter. And the first question here is, where is sovereignty actually located within the American political system? And sovereignty, as a reminder from earlier chapters, sovereignty is ultimate authority within one's own territory. So which level of government has that ultimate authority? And we would say that the federal government probably has more oversight over state governments than the other way around. Now, technically, though, the federal government has its limitations per the Constitution and the case law associated with it. And so sovereignty is largely at the federal level, but really it's all drawn back to the Constitution, and the Constitution is the thing that divides power within our system, which brings me to your second question. How has power been divided between national governments and the states under the Constitution? And there's two major types of powers we want to mention here. First, within the Constitution, you find expressed powers. Those are those powers that are explicitly given to the federal government under the Constitution. So things like the president's power to be commander in chief of the military, or Congress's power to establish post offices, for example, are going to be found word for word within the Constitution. When it comes to state powers, the source of state powers is in the original Constitution, the reserved powers. And so within Article 1 of the Constitution, you find sort of a short list of reserved powers for the states, things that only states can do and not the federal government. It is important to note, though, that the federal government under the purview of the Constitution is limited. It's a constitution of limited power. So it only gives the federal government the power that it says it has in that document. However, two of the major constitutional clauses that we're going to be talking about as we go through this chapter are going to be the necessary and proper clause, which have allowed for growth of federal power over time, and the addition of the 10th Amendment, which in many cases today is still used as sort of the constitutional source of state power. That brings me to our next question. Which competing values are at stake? And there's a few, right? We talk about human nature and liberty versus, need for security in society and things like that. Those aren't really the ones at stake in federalism. In federalism, it's largely centered around the relationship, around power. And so you have really big federal government versus states' rights. And those are kind of the competing things. And there's a lot of arguments we have today about those things. Who should have control over issues like abortion or marijuana legalization are a couple of the issues that have really been prominent in the modern era. So the last question is one for you to kind of just think about. Who should decide matters about which level of government has power and in which cases, those sorts of things. I'll tell you in practice, it's the courts that do it a lot of the time, but you may not agree that that's the best way to go about it, right? So think a little bit about that as we go through the rest of the slides here. I should give you a quick review here of the definition of federalism. And federalism is the system in which the national government shares power with state and local governments. The national government is not, greater than, more powerful than, it shares the power. And state governments have a lot of their own authority over government actions and state decisions. And the existence of state governments under the Constitution is protected as well. So within the body of the Constitution, it's going to set up a process for statehood, and it's going to require that states have republican forms of government, and the existence of state governments is written into the Constitution itself. So they are protected. Now, just because both levels of government are protected under the US Constitution does not mean that we have no political conflict and that this is an easy divide. In fact, the most persistent source of political conflict over time has been the disputes between national and state governments. And the issues have changed over time. And we're going to look at a number of Supreme Court cases next week that sort of trace this history, right? That look at, issues like commerce, issues with the necessary and proper clause, which I said we'll get to in just a little bit, all the way up to issues with, guns on school property and abortion and legalization of marijuana and all of the things that we use sort of as modern examples of this conflict. The issues have changed, but the conflict has been persistent from the beginning. So we can write as much as we want in the Constitution, and I think the framers thought they had this fairly laid out, but they left a lot of wiggle room. The Constitution is really a pretty short document and leaves a lot of room for interpretation, and so that conflict between these two levels of government within the federal system is going to be an ongoing challenge within the history of the republic. Now, why is this worth talking about? We mentioned in chapter 2 a lot of different principles of the Constitution, right? We talk about separation of powers and the three branches and checks and balances and all of these different things. But why is federalism deserving of its own chapter, right? So this is a really bold new plan. This is a new idea that people had not tried. It had been written about here and there, but not extensively, not in the way that separation of powers had been written about, for example. And so when the founders were thinking about what should this new government look like, and the Articles of Confederation had failed, they were like, okay, well, we still want to maintain some level of state power, of state sovereignty, because the founders believed that state governments would be far more representative of the people than the federal government or the national level of government would ever be able to be. And maybe you still find that true today, right? So the idea was that a federation, this federal system, would derive its power directly from the people. And this federation has no precedent. We have no examples in history to look to at this point where you have a system where neither level of government is supreme. And so it's a bold new idea, um, and it's probably scary for them. And so they had to sort of figure out how this was going to work, and that took time. And like I said, the conflict still persists today. So one of the major sources of conflict is the elasticity of the language in the Constitution. The Constitution is a 7-page document, give or take, and it's really fairly short for governing an entire nation for close to 250 years. And so that flexibility in definition and the elastic clause, which is also called the necessary and proper clause, which says Congress can do what's necessary and proper to carry out its other powers, its foregoing powers, that becomes a major source of conflict within this bold new plan. Now, this is a quick review of what we have covered already in the previous chapter, just as a reminder that under the British system and British Parliament, we had a unitary system where the national government had the power, states didn't have power, or counties or any sort of local level of government didn't have power. They maybe were satellite offices for the national level of government, but power is centralized under the throne. We use a confederate system or a confederal system under the Articles of Confederation, where you have decentralized power, the states maintain their sovereignty, and it led to a lot of issues, which we have already covered. One of the most notable being the issues with currency that is going to lead to monetary debt crises throughout the early states and ultimately this fear of anarchy. So let's come up with something in the middle. And this is the middle, right? Federalism is the middle. Equal division of power between state and local governments and federal governments. Now, I would mention here the Constitution does not guarantee the existence of local governments. It guarantees the existence of state governments. And so the federal Constitution divides power only between the federal government and the states at this point, the 50 states that have been admitted to the Union. So both of these levels of government are directly acting upon the citizens at all times. So as a resident of North Dakota, I am subject to North Dakota state law and federal law at the same time. I live under the rule book for both of them, right? And both of them must agree to any changes within the Constitution, this governing document that dictates this relationship. They both have to agree. So Article 5 lays out the amendment process. In the amendment process, you first have proposal of the amendment at the federal level, and then you have approval or ratification of the amendment at the state level. So both levels of government are involved in any changes to this governing document. All right, so the debate over the meaning of federalism and how it would work in practice starts almost immediately. Turns out the Constitution is not as clear-cut as we think when it comes to real-life scenarios where you have disputes between national and state governments. And so the Supreme Court starts to speak on this issue first in 1819 in the Supreme Court case McCulloch versus Maryland, which we'll read more about in the coming weeks here. Now, ultimately, the early Supreme Court is going to allow for some growth of federal power, and that really freaks out some people, like Thomas Jefferson in particular, who is a strong advocate of states' rights. And from a states' rights perspective, there were still some powers that states had to sort of check on the federal level of government. So we've talked about how we had checks and balances between the branches, but there was also some level of checks and balances in this federal system. So one of the early things that states practiced, that states would do, was something called nullification. And you maybe read about or heard about the nullification crises in US history. So, nullification was essentially the practice of states declaring that federal laws were null and void if they believed they were in violation of the Constitution. So states weren't necessarily enforcing or allowing enforcement of federal decisions if they believed that federal decision was a violation of this sort of tiered system of power. Now, ultimately, this issue of nullification becomes a major problem, especially in the years leading up to the Civil War, where southern states were nullifying about everything that the federal government was trying to do. And so in the 14th Amendment, we essentially eliminate nullification as a practice. It's settled by these Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, but the 14th in particular is the one that's going to give some more supremacy to the federal government over the states when it guarantees the equal protection of all citizens living within the jurisdiction of the federal government and its subsidiaries. So the 14th Amendment gives some additional federal power, especially when it comes to issues like equal protection of the laws, due process, so on and so forth. So nullification is no longer a state practice, but it was part of the early history of this federal relationship. So that leads me to a little more discussion on how federalism has changed over time. And so federalism, initially as the founders viewed it, and maybe even prior to the Civil War, looks something like a layer cake, right? So we call this dual federalism. And in dual federalism, you have power over programs that are clearly divided amongst each level. So this layer of the cake, these are federal programs, and this is federal authority. And then this layer of the cake, this is state programs and state authority, local authority, local programs, so on and so forth. It looks like a layer cake. There's no intermixing. The icing is sort of that barrier between the different levels of government. But post-Civil War, and with the addition of the 14th Amendment, we start to have more disputes about federalism and how it will look post-Reconstruction. There is a lot of discussion about the Commerce Clause in particular, which gives Congress the power to regulate economic activity between the states. And so our way of viewing federalism evolves. And today it looks more like a marble cake. We call this cooperative federalism. And in cooperative federalism, programs and authority are really mixed amongst the various levels of government. And so think of something like the interstate highway system, which is funded initially under the Eisenhower administration. Initially, the federal government puts forward a lot of funding, and they look to the states to come up with some plans about where interstates should run, why they should run that way. The states, in doing this process, have to make sure to comply with the federal guidelines that are included in the Act of Congress and get approval before they can get these roads built. And then in the sort of modern age, there's still some federal funding through the Department of Transportation there that allows for maybe the addition of exits on the interstate, for example, or overpasses, depending on growth. But it's ultimately state governments and even local authorities that contract out the work, right? That look for people and companies to do the work and to get the bids. It's state authorities who make sure that we are following the traffic laws on those roadways. It's state authorities that decide within, a certain threshold what the speed limit is going to be on those roadways. Of course, in North Dakota, we just increased the speed limit on interstate to 80 miles per hour. That's still within federal guidelines, right? The federal government has set guidelines on what the minimum and maximum speeds can be on these roadways. So it's this cooperative relationship. There's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of planning together to make these programs work. All right. So, what's it look like today? In my lifetime, we have seen increasing state sovereignty. So in the cases that we're going to look at, we're going to see that we see a lot of growth of federal power for the first 200 years of the republic, right? The Supreme Court continues to allow for some growth. Post Reconstruction allows for more growth of federal power. But like I said, in my lifetime, starting in the late 1900s, oh boy, I was born in the 1900s, right? But in the 90s, we start to see some increasing state sovereignty through Supreme Court decisions and so on and so forth. And so we'll look a little bit at some of those cases. One of those that we're going to pay particular attention to is a case called U.S. versus Lopez, which is about the Commerce Clause as well. In terms of police power, okay, the federal government historically didn't have a ton of police power. Okay, now police power is the power to create laws that promote health and safety and morals, and usually enforcement of that laws requires a police force and things like that. And that power has in large belonged to the states since the early constitutional period. And we've seen continued growth in police power at the state level over time. We've also seen increased political activity of the states coming together, governors coming together to discuss what they can do, how they can do it, what they can advocate for at the federal level to allow for continuous growth of state power. So, what can states do? They can, meet together, come up with plans, like I just mentioned, with, governors coming together. But they can also make their own calls on how they deal with certain types of policy. Like they might decide that in our state, we're going to have referendums or measures or initiatives, we call them, that we're going to allow for recalls, right? We're going to make all kinds of laws that increase the police power of the state or maybe decrease the police power of the state, so on and so forth. Now, I've already mentioned here that the existence of states is guaranteed under the U.S. Constitution. And it's sort of this tug of war, this push and pull between federal and state governments in terms of power over time. But that debate does not happen between state and local governments. And so the question here is, why is there no debate between the powers of state and local governments when there's so much debate between state and federal governments? And ultimately, the power struggle between state and local governments has been settled. The state is supreme. Local governments are not guaranteed in the Constitution, the way that the federal-state relationship is. So the federal-state relationship is not as easily defined. In state constitutions, they may choose to create local school boards, for example, or um, allow for city councils and things like that. But the states could change their constitution. And ultimately, they are the ultimate authority. The state of North Dakota has more power over me and the things that impact my life than the city of West Fargo, for example, right? So that relationship is settled because the existence of local governments is not guaranteed under the Constitution. Local governments are a mechanism for making government more approachable, more efficient, so on and so forth. It helps state governments function better, but they don't have to exist. This is going to be a quick slide here because this is all written down for you in your note guide already, but there are a couple things I want you to add. One, we've talked about expressed powers versus reserved powers, and many of those are listed here. So the federal powers here, these are expressed powers. These are ones that the Constitution explicitly gives to the federal government. Over on the state power side here, you have a number of reserved powers that are listed in the Constitution as well. And then the 10th Amendment becomes the source of state power for basically anything that is not a reserved power. The 10th Amendment, of course, saying that any powers not expressly given to the federal government on the Constitution are reserved for the states. So I would maybe add the 10th Amendment here as a source of additional power. Now, when it comes to modern relationships between state and federal government, one of the biggest push and pulls is going to be about money. Okay, so the federal government provides money to state governments through what we call grants or grants in aid. If you fill out the FAFSA in the coming months here and you apply in that process, you apply for federal grants, that is going to be money that the federal government gives you towards college without having to repay, right? Like Pell Grants, for example, are going to be based on economic need. So grants are money given, okay, not to be paid in return. And so in many cases, the federal government might want the states to do something, but they need to help the states fund that thing. And lots of times grants are used to meet more national needs. And this change starts to take place in the 1960s. So prior to the 1960s, governors would maybe come together, or they would go to their congressperson and they would say, hey, we need money for this. Can we get money for this? And so it was really based on the requests of the states, what they would want money for. But in the modern era, grants are based less on what's being explicitly demanded by state and local officials and more based on what federal officials like our congresspeople or our president perceive to be national needs. So maybe poverty, for example, or homelessness, or that's something that happens everywhere regardless of where you live, and so maybe there's some federal activism on an issue like that. The Obama administration is huge on healthcare. That's largely what he runs on, and it's one of his major early victories in Congress is Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, or the ACA. And so the ACA gives a lot of money to these state governments to deal with this national need of healthcare, just as Medicare and Medicaid do. Environmentalism, environmental issues don't stop at state borders, right? We all share the same air, and so that's a perceived national need, right? And it might not be money that's being requested by the governors. Hey, the state of North Dakota wants some money to clean the air and clean the water, but we might receive it because our congresspeople perceive it as a need of every state in the union. So we've seen sort of a shift from state government control over the money that we request to what's my congressperson think my state needs or think the country needs as a whole. You can see here, this is about 10 years old already, but these are some examples of what the federal government spent money on in grants. This is an older diagram because basically since COVID, our spending has been all over the chart. Because there was a lot more money pumped into grants during COVID to deal with issues like unemployment and healthcare and all of those things. So this is maybe more of the norm. You have federal government spending close to $600 billion in grants to states. You can see among the biggest items you have healthcare, including the cost share with Medicaid. So Medicaid is partially funded by the federal government, partially funded by the states. So you can see that takes up a big piece of the pie. Income security, so that'd be like unemployment. Unemployment benefits are paid through your payroll taxes. Transportation, so that might be maintaining the interstate highways or helping grants for public transportation, so on and so forth. Education, you can see, gets a lot of federal grants as well, and community development too. Now you can see the shift here. So I said prior to 1960, you're making a lot of these decisions on federal money based on what governors are asking for, right? So you can see governors are asking for a lot of money for transportation, a lot of money for income security or unemployment. And then you see the shift that happens in 2014. The vast majority of these grants are going towards healthcare as a major issue. Now, that has changed the way that governors need to advocate for what they want to see, what they need money for. And so you've seen the creation of intergovernmental lobbies where you have associations of governors or associations of mayors that come together and they lobby for more money for states and cities. And one of the ways that they've sort of changed their lobbying is they've changed the types of grants that they're looking for. And so initially, the federal government lots of times wants to give what's called a categorical grant. So a categorical grant is money to be spent on a specific purpose, a specific category. But governors and mayors say these are really hard to adapt to local needs, right? So the categorical grant might be for the addition of hospitals. And that looks very different, like state to state, right? Maybe some states have all the hospitals that they need, but they don't have enough workers to work them. Or maybe some of them, in North Dakota, we have a rural state and we can't support hospitals in every tiny little city across the state. And so maybe we need money to make sure we have transportation for emergency care and things like that. So categorical grants, when there's a specific purpose attached, governors and mayors are going to say this is really hard to adapt across the board nationally. And so they've advocated for something called block grants. And block grants are created in the mid 1960s in response to concerns from state and local officials about categorical grants. And so a block grant might be for a general issue, like this is for healthcare, right? Or innovation in healthcare. And now you can sort of, it's a bigger category, right? It's easier for them to adapt. Now, they work together to lobby, but there's also rivalries amongst the states. And one of those big rivalries we call the Snow Belt versus the Sun Belt. You could probably make some guess what we're in here in North Dakota. In the Snow Belt, not a lot of people live here, right? It's cold. People don't like cold winters. And the Sun Belt is where everyone runs to in the winter, right? It's more population dense, that sort of thing. And so the question is, does the government unfairly help some regions at the expense of others, and especially as populations shift? So as more people move from California to Texas, for example, is California getting too much money based on their current population and Texas isn't getting enough? Um, and you know, grants usually are based on some sort of distributional formula. So, how many people do you have? They do the census count. More people means more money most of the time, which makes sense. Um, but there's no single allocation formula that works really well because, for example, if this is money for building up industry, for example, the number of people doesn't matter as much. There's going to be some initial costs for, maybe it's the construction of more railways or more roads or whatever it may be. Those things cost money whether you have more people or less people. So sometimes the allocation formulas don't work that well, especially for in the snow belt versus sun belt rivalry, especially for those states in the snow belt that have lower populations and things like that. North Dakota, of course, would be one example. Now, one of the final notes I want to make here is that the federal government does not give money to the states with no strings attached. Lots of times they're going to enforce mandates, and mandates, depending on the program and the legislation and the amount of power that the federal government has on the issue, they might apply whether or not aid is accepted. Like, you got to do this regardless. But mandates almost always are in place when you are choosing to accept the money. And most mandates usually concern civil rights, equal protection, environmental protection, so on and so forth. School desegregation plans are one of the best known historical examples of federal mandates, where it's like, okay, well, if you want money for your Department of Education, your state Department of Education, then you must submit a school desegregation plan. Another example I'm going to give you, in 1984, President Reagan signed the National Minimum Drinking Age Act. And prior to this act, every state could decide their own drinking age. So when my mom was this age, she kind of lived in the tri-state area, so Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota within pretty easy access. And so in one state you had a drinking age of 21, in another state you had a drinking age of 19, and in another state a drinking age of 18. Well, the National Minimum Drinking Age Act creates a law that requires all states to raise their drinking age to 21 or face the loss of 10% of their public transportation budgets. So, transportation was a huge piece of the pie, as we saw a couple slides ago. States don't want to lose that money, so they decide to comply. And so each state ups their drinking age and ultimately then receives their full public transportation budget through the Federal Aid Highway Act. Now, as I said, in the last 30, 40 years, we have seen more state sovereignty, and that has led to what we call a devolution revolution. So, a devolution is a transfer of power to a lower level. So, this is something that historically the federal government has done, but we're going to give it back to the states or the local government. And we've seen that in a lot of different issues. One of the most notable recently would be the overturning of Roe versus Wade in the Dobbs decision, which allows this shift from federal authority over the issue of abortion to state authority over that issue. And so we've seen the shift of federal functions back to the states. And many Americans do favor devolution. They like this idea of more state power, but we don't like the idea if that means that there's not going to be federal money anymore, right? Like we want more control over the issue, but we also still want your money, right? And rightfully so, the federal government usually says you can't have both. And so some of the consequences of devolution, or this increase in state power and decrease in federal power, has been cuts in federal funding, and plenty of news stories today about cuts to federal programs and things like that. So cuts in federal funding. Um, we've actually seen more, not less, government regulations, because the national government still wants states to comply with certain issues and certain mandates, even if the money is there. So instead of making laws that have mandates attached or funding that has mandates attached, they just make a new regulation, which is essentially a federal rule. And it's led to a fairly substantial decrease in welfare programs, as well as the federal government has backed off some of that spending. So as a result, many states today face debts. They don't have budget surpluses. In North Dakota, we are fortunate in that we have a oil industry that has really allowed us to build our coffers and build up money and be able to spend money in a way that a lot of states can't afford right now. And this leads states to consider then which financial responsibilities are most important. What are they going to continue to fund, or are they going to advocate for more federal control so they can, pull back some of that funding as well? So it leads to the question, how will states continue to address long-term debts if they are in that position? So devolution has its pros and cons as well. And that is a wrap on Chapter 3 and Unit 1. Have a great rest of your day.